Welcome to the next session on this dynamic of restoration. On the last one, we looked at this downward progression, and we ended with the unrestorable spirit. We said they can't be restored. So we're gonna just take them off the table. You know, if you have, let me tell you how to deal with the unrestorable spirit. If you genuinely have one, and you have the authority to get rid of them, you ought to fire them. I mean, they can be that destructive to the organization. Fortunately, again, there's not that many of them. And there's great hope, I think, for the other categories. But if you legitimately have an unrestorable spirit and you have the authority to do so, it has to be the right circumstances, they have to commit the right offense or whatever, then you should try to either terminate them or put them in a position within the organization where you can minimize their damage, because they can be very destructive. But let's look at how to restore the rebellious spirit here for the next several minutes. And we're going to look specifically at the character quality of obedience. Now, obedience, we have to be very careful with definitions. I spent a lot of time in police dynamics dealing with definitions. We defined the character qualities. We defined various terms throughout the training, because you have to nail these things down very carefully, particularly if you're going to incorporate them into your policies and procedures and practices within the organization, and if you're going to hold people accountable to them. I mean, for legal purposes and many other purposes, just the ethical obligation you have to make sure people understand the standard, you have to articulate these things very carefully. We wrote many of them down into our standards manual back at the sheriff's office, and we use other documentation that contains these definitions, including the police dynamics training manuals and the e-book, etc. But the definition of obedience, that's the countering character quality for a rebel, is obedience, because that's what they're having problems with. They're having problems with their obedience. They're rebellious to authority. And we want to define obedience very carefully, because the dictionary definition would probably say something like, well, somebody in a position of authority over you gives you an instruction, an order, a directive, a policy, whatever, and you go out and follow those instructions. And so obedience becomes synonymous with following instructions. But character-based obedience, remember, our definition of character is the inward motivation to do the right thing regardless of the circumstances and regardless of the cost. Character springs from the heart. So we're trying to put on our supervision goggles, I've used the metaphor before, and look like x-ray vision into the hearts of the people that are on our staff and that we associate with, so that we can get an idea of where they fall in terms of these very difficult arenas of character, because character itself can't be observed. The behavior that character motivates, the behavior can be observed. The attitude that manifests itself, that can be observed, and we use those observations very keenly and very carefully to make evaluations about people's underlying character, which is within the heart. So, a character-based definition of obedience is very different. And the definition I like to use is this: quickly and cheerfully fulfilling the expectations of my authorities. Now, there's an awful lot in that one little definition, and we're going to pick it apart a little bit. I like it because it tells us a lot. First thing it tells us is when. You know, when do I obey? It says quickly. Something I tried to communicate to my children, more or less successfully, I think, is the idea that delayed obedience is disobedience. In other words, if you are genuinely being an obedient person, you should obey the instructions of your authority as soon as possible. It doesn't always mean you drop everything at that instant to go and be obedient. There may be other factors, other circumstances, there's conflicting priorities, and we understand all of that, and that's not the attitude. The attitude is we don't want to be lazy, and we don't want to procrastinate. We want to be as obedient as quickly as is feasible under the circumstances, given the totality of the situation, and what the urgency of the order and directive, and balancing that against other priorities and instructions that we might have otherwise. So that's a clear indication. So first of all, quickly, and then the second question that gets answered is how. How do I go about fulfilling these expectations and being obedient? And it's cheerfully, with a cheerful attitude, because we all know about, we know that it's technically possible to be obedient to instructions and still, in other words, we can be obedient in our behavior, let's say, and still be rebellious in our attitude. in our character. I think about the child that's standing up in a chair, and his mother yells at him, sit down in that chair, and the kid sits down and is over there fuming, and he says, well, I might be sitting down on the outside, but on the inside I'm still standing up. And that's a rebellious attitude that might manifest itself in obedient actions. And so we have to be careful about distinguishing behavior, which most of our policies and our procedures and our disciplinary actions deal with behavior. It's all behavior based, and try to go deeper into the character aspects of the attitude that motivates that behavior. So in the same way that it is technically possible to be obedient in behavior and rebellious in attitude, it is also technically possible to be respectful and submissive in attitude and to be disobedient in behavior. That's a subject for a whole nother topic, because the question gets asked, well, are you advocating blind obedience? Well, absolutely not. There are times when your authority is acting under authority. You've got layers of authority, and some of them are out from under authority. And when an authority acts outside of their jurisdiction, that's a whole other dynamic of jurisdictions, then we're not obligated to be obedient to them. We're still obligated to be respectful, however, and to be submissive in our attitude. And that's a real short analysis of that particular principle that we get into in depth in the dynamic of jurisdictions, and how to make an appeal, and how do you deal with unlawful instructions, and how do you deal with conflicting orders and things of that nature. And we talk about that in depth, because that's very real. Those are very real circumstances that crop up inside any organization, and law enforcement is certainly no exception to that. So we know when, quickly, how, cheerfully, and what. What do we want to do? Well, if you look at the definition very carefully, I say fulfilling the expectations. Not necessarily following the instructions, but fulfilling the expectations. In other words, I can technically follow the instructions or follow the policy and miss the expectations altogether. But if I truly want to be obedient in my heart and my character, then I got to be thinking about, what does my authority want to accomplish here, and what can I do to go about fulfilling that expectation. A great illustration of this from a law enforcement perspective would be something like this. Let's imagine I've got a chronic complainer, and I think about a situation back home where I had a guy that owned a private parking lot. He had a business there, and it was very close to the high school, and every day at the end of school, the kids that were allowed to drive their cars would cut across this parking lot. Well, some of them would walk. They'd cut across this parking lot and take a shortcut home to a neighborhood that was behind the parking lot, and it drove this guy bananas. He went insane, and periodically, regularly, he was always calling me on the phone. You got to do something about these kids trespassing on my property, etc., etc. And so let's just imagine the scenario for a moment. I'm just fed up with getting these phone calls, and I see a new officer, an officer that's on my staff. A deputy comes by, and I grab him and I say, hey, I need you to go out here to this parking lot. It's right across from the high school. Kids cutting across, trespassing. Guys getting all fed up. I'm really tired of getting these phone calls. I'm sick and tired of these phone calls. Will you please go over there and handle this situation once and for all, so I don't continue to get all these phone calls? And that's kind of a problem-oriented policing, right? I gave him a task, a problem, and sent him out to get the job done. So let's say that this officer comes back, an hour later, and I ask him, well, did you handle that situation for me out there? And he says, oh yeah, Sheriff, I handled that situation. Yeah, absolutely I did. You won't have any more calls from that guy, I can guarantee you that. And of course I start to think, that's an odd way to say it. I wonder what's going on here. Well, what did you do when you got there? He said, I told that man that you were sick and tired of getting those phone calls. There was nothing that we could do to solve his problem, and he was just going to have to learn to live with it, but don't call you anymore. I'm like, oh my gosh. That's not what I was hoping for at all. Now the question is, in that scenario, was the deputy technically obedient to my instructions? Did he do what I told him to do? And the answer would be yes. I said, go over there, identify the problem. I said, do whatever's necessary. I don't want to get any more of these phone calls on these complaints. And so technically he did what I told him to do. Did he do what I expected him to do? And the answer is clearly no, he didn't. And it's not that he didn't know. I mean, he might pull that stunt. Oh, well, I didn't know you wanted me to be nice to him, Sheriff. If you had told me that, well, I would have been nice. I thought you just didn't want any more phone calls. I'm so sorry. That'll never happen again. And that's a bunch of BS. That's a bunch of baloney. You know what that is? That's rebellion in disguise. The guy's got a rebellious heart, and he thinks he's got me over a barrel. He thinks because I didn't technically tell him what to do exactly, specifically, that he's off the hook. Or if I didn't spell it out in a policy exactly, specifically, step by step, that he's off the hook. And that's simply not true, because you wouldn't have to be around me very long, you wouldn't have to work for me very long, to know what I expect out of my deputies. And that's not it. That's a rebel in disguise. And so thankfully, because we have very, very carefully defined these terms, such as this definition of obedience, written it into our policy, our standards manual, we communicate it during training, we utilize it during disciplinary proceedings, etc., etc. He's not off the hook. He's not off the hook at all. Now, I will have to say this. If there is any element of doubt whatsoever, if there's any doubt in your mind as to whether or not he really knew or didn't know, the tie's got to go to the runner. You got to give him the benefit of the doubt. I think that's just good leadership. But if this person has had a pattern of this, and you've already dealt with it through counseling or other types of corrective actions, then you shouldn't have this problem anymore. And if I do give him the benefit of the doubt, and I do say, well, maybe I wasn't as clear as I needed to be, and maybe he really wasn't trying to undermine me here in my relationship with this citizen, this business owner, but still, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, yes, but we're going to use this as a teachable moment. I'm going to take advantage of this situation to very, very clearly communicate to this deputy how inappropriate that behavior and action was, and it's not at all in keeping with my expectations. And then if a repeat of it happens, now I can show that there's been this progressive discipline, and that I have made it very, very, very clear to this officer about what my expectations are and how I expect him to deal with citizens out there on the streets. Now, much more that could be said about this, but we're going to cut it short for this training session. So the dynamic of restoration, we're looking at the rebel spirit, how to restore him, and we're going to try to encourage this attitude of obedience, and we're going to do it through our standards, our policies. We're going to do it through our communicating through our training. We're going to apply it consistently from a disciplinary standpoint as we enforce that standard. And of course, we're absolutely going to set a good example with ourselves and with the leadership within the organization to develop that culture of character that encourages this type of attitude, that in turn is going to motivate officers to having proper actions and behaviors that are consistent with not only the standards of the organization, but they're consistent with good character. And in this case, we're looking at the character quality of obedience. Until next time, Sheriff Ray Nash here.